Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Commercial Awareness Compass, your weekly guide to developing commercial insight that goes beyond just the headlines. Each week, we take one major story and break it down to help you progress through three levels: beginner, intermediate, and advanced commercial awareness. Whether you're just starting out or already have some understanding, this program is here to help you think like a commercial lawyer. By the end of today's session, you'll have practical insights that you can use in applications and interviews. So today's episode, we're focusing on the intersection of law and politics. So how government decisions, geopolitical events, and shifting policies can rapidly change legal frameworks and impact businesses around the world. In a globalized market, understanding the link between politics and the law is essential for any commercial advisor. So my name is Daniel Shepherd. I'm a law conversion student and a future trainee solicitor. Today I'm joined by Henry, a senior associate at Thrive Law with expertise in commercial law, technology, and regulatory strategy. Henry brings experience advising clients on cross-border risk, sanctions, and legal challenges at the intersections of global politics and business. So welcome today, Henry. How are we doing?
Yeah, really good. Thank you. I think you've got a really interesting topic today that showcases a different side of what commercial awareness can mean. So looking forward to it.
I think this is going to be a really good one to kind of expand on a lot of the episodes that we've done previously, kind of looking at what we've done in a different lens and helping people flush that out a little bit more in interviews, which, I'm excited to get into it. So would you like to break down kind of what we're talking about this week?
Yeah, sure. So we're talking about the intersection of politics and the law. And this kind of refers to how legal systems and decisions by sort of firms and clients are influenced by political decisions, changes to government policies when new governments come in, and also the actions of our elected officials. So it's kind of important to recognize that the law and sort of the black letter law that we may learn in law school doesn't kind of exist in isolation. This can change with governments. This can change as kind of things shift around the world. And ultimately, this then impacts certain decisions that clients will make as a result of these sort of changes in policies.
So what do we mean when we're talking about geopolitics, and how does that impact the legal world?
Yeah, geopolitics essentially refers to how political events and relationships between various countries across the globe kind of impact the economies, markets, and sort of the legal frameworks. And we can kind of see that at the moment on a very sort of high level sort of analysis, kind of talking about it with the ongoing war in Ukraine, sort of the conflict in Gaza, and the continued bombing of Gaza, sort of what's going on in the USA. All of these will kind of have huge implications on not only the markets. If you take sort of Elon and Trump, for example, and the impact on Tesla stock, you can just see the huge shift that that's had. So that's kind of what it means. And then ultimately, as lawyers and law firms, they will need to be advising on clients of what's going on and how this is going to impact certain sectors, markets, and clients contained within those.
So how can political changes directly affect a lawyer's day-to-day work?
Yeah, for sure. So a lot of these sort of political events and ongoing sort of global geopolitical issues, for example, can have huge impacts on how we here as lawyers in the UK, for example, deal with our clients. And one of those could be just on matter opening. So for those that don't know, when you onboard a new client, you have to do what's known as sort of KYC, know your client checks. And that's basically sort of your annual anti sort of money laundering. These aren't sort of sanctioned individuals, X, Y, and Z. And that could, that's done to make sure that we're acting for clients that aren't in breach of any of these sort of, let's just say, sanctions based against them. And an example of that is, again, when Russia sort of initiated a war on Ukraine, is a lot of countries across the globe put sanctions on certain members of sort of like the Russian elite, for example. So then they were sanctioned, the assets that they were held in sort of banks in London were frozen. They couldn't be sort of represented or acted for by law firms, and so on. It could also impact deal timings. If we've got some sort of instability in the market as a result of a geopolitical event, clients may want to push a deal back. They may not be ready to now sell the company because the market isn't what it looked like when they originally floated the idea. So that could kind of push things back. And then more simply, it could also just impact sort of boilerplate clauses contained in the contract, one of which got a lot of talk and discussion around when COVID came into effect, is the force majeure clause. And again, for those that don't know, a force majeure clause is basically a clause in a contract that says if, for example, there is an act of God, like an earthquake or X, Y, and Z in that sort of the remit, if there is a war, if there is like a nuclear attack, whatever it may be, the contract will be paused for X amount of time, and if because services cannot be performed. And if services cannot be performed for a set period of time after that, they cannot be restored. The contract will be terminated and X, Y, and Z will apply. So if there is something like that that's within the scope of the force majeure clause, like a war, then that clause will be fundamental to the operation of that contract and whether or not a party is in breach of the contract because they cannot perform the service, or if this force majeure provision comes into effect.
What would be quite nice to set out the beginner level as well. So we've kind of talked about sanctions and force majeure clause. Are there any other legal concepts that are quite important when we talk about quite volatile political times?
Yeah, on top of sort of sanctions that we just spoke about, there are also what we know is sort of international treaties. So there will be specific agreements between certain countries or a collection of countries that kind of agree to certain things. And when we're advising clients, we need to make sure, particularly clients working sort of globally, is these treaties are in effect. You need to make sure you are complying with this. And that could be in terms of data protection. That could also be in terms of environmental regulations. We see a lot of these sort of international kind of treaties provisions around the fishing, for example, because obviously international waters, who can do what, when. And we also have sort of trade barriers and trade tariffs, which is something we've spoken about in the previous episode in light of Trump being elected and looking to impose various tariffs on various different countries, which again impacts not only the cost of those goods and sort of that are being brought in and out of the country, but also where clients then look to, I don't know, send their products for sale, manufacture their products. And again, as lawyers, it's our role to be sort of assessing this and advising clients accordingly.
I think that's a really good way to kind of round out the beginner session. So we'll kind of look more about like how this is more put into practice. So how do law firms help clients with things such as onboarding and sanctions, especially when things move so quickly?
Yeah, for sure. So when we're looking to onboard a client, a lot of the know your clients checks will kind of have standard due diligence and enhanced due diligence. And enhanced due diligence, we largely want to see that when we're perhaps dealing with clients and organizations that are more higher on the risk scale. They originate in certain countries, they operate over here, X, Y, and Z, and they're kind of linked to these high risk regions, like we mentioned Russia, like Israel, for example. And that's when we want to be doing deeper background checks to make sure that we can lawfully act for these individuals. And again, in doing so, there'll be certain red flags that we want to be looking out for, like, is this person or are the directors of this company perhaps politically exposed persons, which then they could be more likely to be influenced by sort of bribes or ulterior kind of influence, which isn't great. Corporate structures of certain organizations you can't really work out who is owning what company because the whole structure is a bit sort of bamboozling. And again, that would be a red flag for me. Or also organizations or individuals that have ties to the state. That again would be a major red flag.
So we mentioned in the beginner section kind of boilerplate clauses.
Yeah,
So why do they suddenly become kind of critical for businesses in volatile situations?
yeah, absolutely. If say, for example, a force majeure clause, one, it's not really a political example, but I think it's a relatively clear and straightforward one to use. Is if we take COVID, for example, um, a lot of service providers or goods providers couldn't perform their obligations under a contract because of COVID. So then we have to look at the force majeure clause to say there is an act outside of our control that means that we cannot provide these services. You are trying to sue us for a breach of contract for non-performance, but the reason for that non-performance is a force majeure reason. Therefore, the force majeure provision applies, and you cannot sue us for material breach of the contract or breach more generally. Sorry. So what we want to make sure is that the force majeure clause then going forwards includes pandemics and epidemics, because then if another COVID, the next version comes along, and we all have to kind of isolate for whatever reason, and we have a repeat of 2020, we won't be in breach of that contract because we can see in the force majeure clause that it is explicitly referenced. And we see that with acts of terrorism, war, and a whole host of sort of extreme, I say extreme in the loose sense because we're living a lot of this across the globe right now. But that's where those sort of scenarios are sort of based.
So, kind of coming off of that, how should companies, like when they're trying to organize themselves and kind of prepare for these sorts of situations, how should companies update their data, ESG, and jurisdiction policies as regulations shift?
For law firms, again, it's one of those things that to be able to assess and advise our clients accordingly, we need to be keeping up to date with what's going on sort of across the political landscape, across sort of the business landscape, to make sure that we can see what's kind of coming up. Obviously, we can't see a lot, but you can kind of guess where there are going to be tensions. And if you've got clients that are in those sort of high risk areas that are likely to be affected, let's just say, for example, we thought that Trump was coming in January. If we've got clients that operate in the US or within the US, sorry, we should then be thinking, okay, this might likely happen. This might likely happen. He's said this, this, and this in his manifesto. What does that mean for our clients? This war is ongoing. This is happening in this country. The Middle East is quite volatile. How does that impact our clients within certain sectors? Like oil, for example, energy, renewables, infrastructure. If we've got clients within those sectors, how is this going to impact them? So kind of staying on top of that is essential.
Does that mean that a lot of lawyers and a lot of firms kind of benefit from kind of cross practice collaboration? So, kind of within their different departments, all working together when they're dealing with like sensitive geopolitical matters. Sorry.
Yeah, and that is something that for those that have not yet sort of paralegal or worked in a law firm as trainees, etc., you will find that most departments like corporate, public, trade, regulatory, whatever it may be, do not work entirely in isolation. There are so many departments that cross collaborate, that work together, that need, let's just say you're working in corporate, you're working on an M&A, and it involves buying X company, a different jurisdiction, by a company like structure or entity, whatever. Here, what does that look like? You're likely going to want some international advice. You're likely to want some trade and regulatory advice. So that's when you would get that level of cross collaboration.
I guess that's quite a good thing to add for those who are doing interviews as well. You know, in a lot of or assessment centres where they do ask, maybe for an example on how a certain department would deal with a certain situation, kind of looking outside that department and seeing who else could they contact and work with in order to give the client the best advice.
Yeah, exactly. And also, it's a really good way when you're a trainee to get exposure to the different departments, because you'll be working closely with them as a trainee. You might be sort of managing a project, you might be sort of managing document checklists, whatever it may be. So you can then start building your sort of internal network as well. So on sort of more personal side of things and developing your own career, that's where you can kind of get like a vague sort of insight into what that department does. So say, for example, your next seat is in trade and regulatory and you're currently in corporate, you've been working with them and you've got a few sort of contacts and connects that you've been liaising with directly on a matter. When you go into that team, you've already got that familiarity, you've got that level of comfort, and you've got a very, very, albeit base level of knowledge to go into. But then you'll also understand how the work that you're doing in that team then sort of casts back to how it impacts the work that the corporate team are doing.
Yes, definitely. And as we kind of mentioned earlier in the different examples of kind of the different areas that had been disrupted, how are clients advised differently on kind of sector specific risks rather than more just global general risks?
With sector specific risks, I would say that is more impacted by the nature of sort of the geopolitical issues. So say if we touched on this briefly, sort of a level of like unsettling times as in the Middle East. We know that's quite a heavy area in terms of sort of oil and infrastructure. If we have clients within that section, that is obviously going to be a geopolitical issue that's a hot topic for those clients within that sector. So that's when you kind of need to be focusing on what's going on there. How's that going to impact clients? Is that going to be supply? Is that going to be costs? What do the contracts look like? How are they going to be impacted? And just kind of assessing that level of risk.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's quite an interesting one, kind of looking at it from both perspectives, giving kind of general advice in how things are updating and companies should update and move with the times, I guess, but also in different sectors. Obviously, you'll have different specialisms within law firms who work with specific sectors because they know kind of how those areas run. But kind of being able to give both sorts of advice to give the client like the best rounded picture, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. I'd add to that as well that just more and more of a interview and research for the firms that you're applying for level is that make sure you research. Oh, it sounds straightforward, but the amount of people that forget or just kind of not make up, but mix up sectors that firms work in. Make sure you know the sectors that the firm works in. So when you're applying, you're talking about a sector that's actually relevant. Sorry, so you're not going to say talk about oil and infrastructure when actually the firm that you're applying for doesn't do that. So whilst you're giving a great example of commercial awareness and geopolitical impacts, it's not relevant to that firm's clients, which again is great for the commercial awareness side of things, but it doesn't show that you've kind of fully researched and understood what that firm is about and the work that it does.
Yeah, if you go into a firm that specializes in entertainment law, I think though they may be impressed on your knowledge of oil-based interactions, but they might not be too impressed if you think that that's what they do. So, so if we move to the advanced section and we kind of look at the long term of kind of future proofing and stuff like that, how can firms and clients use scenario planning, tracking systems, and kind of playbooks to manage fast changing geopolitical risks?
One really helpful tool that a lot of firms will have for various different sort of systems is having tracking systems in place that will have platforms sort of linked to it that will monitor sort of ongoing geopolitical risks. Sort of if there's a sanction list for X, Y, and Z, who's on that sanction list, and also just the developments around that in real time. So you're getting sort of notifications and things to say, this has happened today. What's the implication of that? And just kind of making sure that you understand what's actually going on, because it's not going to look great if a client calls you to say, this has happened. We think we're worried how this is going to impact our sector, and you're not aware of that, which we're all busy with our day-to-day jobs. It's quite hard to actively go out and keep on top of things. But if we've got this tracker, it definitely helps. And then also firms may want to have sort of playbooks ready for clients that are in certain sectors that are high risk or that may be heavily impacted, to say this is how we deal with them, this is how we sort of anticipate the ongoing risks, and this is kind of what we're going to do in those scenarios. So that again, it comes down to how can we add value to these clients other than just saying, this is going on, but this is the law. Just say this is coming up, this is happening, this might impact your sector for X, Y, and Z reasons.
So I guess, ironically, it's a way of just being very advanced commercial awareness but in more in a practical sense. So maybe they should subscribe to the Commercial Awareness Compass as well to keep up with regular updates. But what's kind of involved when supporting businesses when there are like disruptions? So kind of like moving operations or kind of with supply chains. When the political environment changes.
Yeah, exactly. So you mentioned they're sort of moving operations. If you're operating out of the country that's in volatile situations right now, you may think as a client and as a lawyer, you want to be supporting and reviewing and advising them of this and the risks and pros and the cons of moving their supply chain out of that country for whatever reason it may be. You're going to move over to here instead. Again, to kind of mitigate risks, and we can also have, and I think that's probably more like in sectors, where it's more focused on manufacturing and things where you actually need to uproot and move your supply chain. I would say for like digital and tech, where a lot of it's online, that may be harder to do. It also may be a case of going through the contracts and looking how they're structured, looking what's in them, and maybe looking to restructure them, changing supply chains, and just a whole host of reasons to say we no longer. And also, you have to also think from a perspective that if we just take the ongoing war in Ukraine by Russia, a lot of businesses that may be operating in Russia, or clients that are operating in Russia, but don't want to be tied to Russia for X, Y, and Z reasons, and even just from an optics perspective, that may like harm their business being associated with Russia. How do we safely move our kind of business out of that as well? So that's something that needs to be taken into consideration.
And so when we've kind of touched around this a little bit about kind of like multi-jurisdictional compliance. So especially when we've got like treaties or we've talked about tariffs, or like there's so many different areas where there's multi-jurisdictional obligations. How do lawyers map that when a company shifts their operations globally?
I think for law firms, it's essentially just kind of sitting down with the client and saying, where are we at? What have we got going on? I'm fully understanding. Sorry, for a lot of companies, their company structure, particularly international companies, is quite complex. So kind of understanding what subsidiaries are doing what, which ones are dormant, which ones are for X countries, and just having a look down and then just mapping that on top of the kind of the regulatory state, geopolitical landscape, and saying, this is for this is for that. We may want to rethink this, and then navigating with your lawyers sort of the most effective legal way to be able to do that, to make sure that ultimately we need to be providing advice to kind of mitigate risk for that company.
So we've also talked about kind of the providing advice, but how important is it for law firms to kind of engage with kind of governments and regulatory bodies in order to receive the advice from them also?
Yeah, a lot of law firms will be kind of involved, and we get sort of, when new legislation is coming in, we get lobbying, we get sort of the government may want input from law firms, and kind of whilst lawyers are trained on the law, they may not necessarily be heavily involved in the actual regulatory government side of things. So having, sorry, I'm a dry throat, having that kind of insight and thought leadership from those in that space can help. And we're seeing more law firms kind of bring in sort of strategic advisors and guidance in that space. I think DLA recently hired, we spoke about this briefly earlier, David Cameron, and obviously as a former prime minister, he will have a different level of knowledge than a lawyer that hasn't sat in the role of prime minister, and just kind of the different thoughts and the way that they would approach something and think about an issue or in that space will be different to what a lawyer does. So to be able to have that kind of insight as a layer on top of how we perform our role as lawyers, I think for the most part can add a lot of value.
Yeah, definitely. And the final question, because I know it wouldn't be it'd be a missed opportunity if I didn't ask about technology and AI. We absolutely love it on the Compass. So how is technology such as AI and kind of analytical tools helping law firms and clients track and manage political risk?
Again, it's AI in the law is very much a hot topic right now. You can't scroll through LinkedIn without seeing it on at least three. But it is a really interesting space, and having sort of tools that are sort of pumped and kind of, what's the word I want, run by AI can effectively help law firms and lawyers sort of do real-time contract reviews to flag like high risk clauses. What are the force majeure clauses saying? We can also have tech that can monitor and ping geopolitical risk data in sort of real time, so we can make sure that we've got this level of compliance. And again, even for something more basic like the KYC we spoke about and going through the standard DD or the enhanced DD and identifying if somebody's a politically exposed person. For example, if we've got a tool that can sort of immediately send a notification to say X is linked to this sanctions list, because we all make mistakes. Sometimes they get missed if we're doing it manually or if we're doing the checks because everybody's busy. Obviously, we don't want these things to be missed, but having the support of AI can definitely enhance that.
Definitely. And I think it'd be a good point to make as well, kind of with the overarching theme of the episode and kind of applying it to assessments and interviews. This is not only is it a great topic for obviously law students to use when they're talking about assessments and interviews and kind of expanding on what they want to talk about, but also for non-law students who maybe come from backgrounds in geography, could even be computer science when we're talking about AI, could be history, politics, and any of those sort of subjects. You're kind of able to nicely show where your level of expertise are and kind of what you can bring to a firm outside of doing law school. So I think it's a really, really nice one to kind of take something away from and add kind of what your speciality is, whether that's kind of conflict management or kind of, it could be geographical planning or anything kind of like that. This is a nice one that you can take away quite a lot from in order to bring it back up and kind of show your skill set if you are a non-law student.
I completely agree that this shows we spoke about this briefly earlier, that it shows a different side of commercial awareness. That it's not just X business sold this or this new law came in and said this is happening. It's more that on a global, wider scale, it's kind of shown the influence of politics on decisions that need to be made by lawyers and clients and how we advise them accordingly, because these are things that affect us every single day across the globe for a whole host of reasons. But what's the impact on our actual clients and what can we do to help them mitigate risks?
Yeah, definitely. So thank you so much for joining us today, Henry. I've really enjoyed this episode. And thank you for everyone else for joining today's Commercial Awareness Compass. So remember, when being commercially aware isn't just about following the news, it's about understanding how these developments shape business decisions and legal strategies. Whether you're just starting out or thinking like a commercial advisor, always ask, how does this impact clients and what can a law firm do to help? Join us next week to keep building your commercial awareness. And until then, prepare without the panic. Thank you.